Ladies and gentlemen, time is the greatest currency you will ever own. More powerful than money, more valuable than status, and more fleeting than anything else in this world. Every second that passes is the second you will never get back, and yet, look around you. How many people live as if time were infinite? They drift, they waste, they scroll, they drown themselves in distractions, and then they wonder why they wake up one day feeling enslaved, not by chains of iron, but by chains of comfort, fear, and mediocrity. And let me tell you the truth that too many people are afraid to say. Most of you are living like slaves right now, not to another man with a whip, but to systems, to habits, to illusions. And unless you lock in, unless you decide to take back the ownership of your mind and your minutes, you will die a slave to forces that laugh at your weakness. I don't speak of slavery in the historical sense. I speak of a modern slavery, the invisible kind. Neuroscience has shown us that the human brain adapts quickly to its environment. If you live in constant distraction, your brain rewires itself for short attention spans. If you live in fear, your amygdala, the fear center, fires more often, making you timid, hesitant, reactive. If you live in debt, in dependency, in low standards, your brain normalizes that state. It convinces you this is life, and that is slavery. It's slavery without shackles, slavery without cages, slavery without guards, but it is slavery nonetheless. Because the cruelest kind of imprisonment is when the prisoner no longer believes he is trapped. Example, picture a young man in his 20s. He wakes up each day and checks his phone before he even breathes deeply. Notifications, pings, emails, social feeds. It's all there, shaping his brain before his mind has a chance to think. He rushes through breakfast, half engaged, maybe scrolling while he eats. He goes to a job doesn't love, for a paycheck just big enough to keep him from quitting, just small enough to keep him desperate. He comes home exhausted, turns on a screen, numbs his mind until sleep. And then he repeats. Where in that cycle is freedom? Where in that cycle is life? That is not living. That is programmed existence. That is the modern plantation. Only now the cotton is replaced with content and the whip is replaced with dopamine hits from a glowing screen. Now here's the science. Every time you give into distraction, every time you avoid the hard thing, you reinforce neural pathways in the brain. Your brain works on efficiency. If you repeatedly choose easy, your brain builds a freeway for easy. If you repeatedly choose focus, discipline, and deep work, your brain builds a freeway for resilience. You are literally wiring yourself for slavery or for freedom every single day. And you cannot outsource this. No one can do it for you. Not your parents, not your boss, not your government. Freedom is self-built. And let's speak about history for a moment. Generations before us fought for freedoms we take for granted. Freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of opportunity. But here's the irony. Even with those freedoms in our pocket, people choose chains. They choose to numb themselves with drugs, with endless entertainment, with excuses. They choose to obey the dictates of fear and procrastination instead of the discipline of vision and courage. We live in a world where the gates are wide open, but most people sit in the cell and never walk out. Why? Because walking out is hard. Because walking out means uncertainty, accountability, responsibility. And the truth is, most people would rather be comfortably enslaved than uncomfortably free. But not you. Not if you were in this room, not if you were listening to my voice, because you wouldn't be here if there wasn't a spark inside you that screams for something more. And that spark is the beginning of locking in. Locking in means making the decision to shut out the noise and master your mind. Locking in means choosing the hard road because you know the easy road is a death sentence, disguised as comfort. Locking in means treating time as sacred, as if every hour were a brick in the empire you are building. Let me tell you about an experiment in psychology. Rats were placed in cages with 2 water bottles, one plain water, one laced with drugs. The rats almost always overdosed, but when scientists changed the environment, added toys, tunnels, companions, the rats ignored the drug water and chose life. What does this tell us? Environment is everything. Your brain is the rat and your daily environment is the cage. If your cage is filled with distractions, toxic people, and easy options, you'll choose slavery every time. But if you build an environment, a purpose, challenge, and accountability, you'll choose freedom. So the question is, what kind of cage are you living in? Who are the people around you? What are the habits you practice daily? What is the food you feed your mind? Because neuroscience is clear, you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your environment. And if your environment is weak, your brain will adapt to weakness. That's why I say, lock in. Build a cage so strong, so filled with purpose, that your only option is growth. Now, let's talk about the enemy within. The brain has a default mode network. It's the part of the brain that activates when you are not engaged in a task. And what does it do? It drifts. It wanders. It thinks about regrets, fears, what ifs. Left unchecked, it becomes the breeding ground of self-doubt and hesitation. Most people live there. They let the default mode run their lives. But when you lock in, when you deliberately engage your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for focus, planning, execution, you overpower that drift. You override the slave circuits and activate the circuits of leadership. You want an example of locking in? Look at someone who came from nothing, who had no safety net, and yet built greatness. Think of the immigrants who arrived with no language, no network, no money, and within years, they own businesses, build families, and carve out success. What's the difference? They didn't have the luxury of drifting. They had to lock in. Comfort is the enemy of freedom. Necessity forces clarity. That's why those with nothing often build empires, while those with everything squander it. And I'll tell you something you might not want to hear. You say you want freedom. You say you want to escape slavery. But freedom isn't free. It requires sacrifice. It requires blood, sleepless nights, brutal honesty with yourself. It requires cutting off people you love if they refuse to grow. It requires facing the mirror and admitting that the chains around your neck were put there by your own choices. That is the hardest truth. Because once you admit that, you can no longer blame anyone else. You must act. Ladies and gentlemen, let me stop here before I continue too far. The path I am about to open next will take us deeper into the biology of willpower, the psychology of execution, and the real tactical steps to lock in and break free once and for all. But before I go on, do you want me to continue? Let's dive deeper into what it truly means to break free, because freedom is not just a metaphorical word we toss around. It is a biological state, a neurological condition, and a psychological war. You see, willpower is not some mystical energy that only a chosen few possess. Willpower is a resource housed in the prefrontal cortex, fueled by glucose and oxygen, strengthened like a muscle through consistent use. Studies in neuroscience show that when people practice self-control in one area of life, say resisting junk food, they actually increase their self-control in other areas, like studying, working, or saving money. Discipline compounds across domains. And here's the twist. If you don't train willpower, it atrophies, just like an unused muscle. That's why you see people start strong in January with resolutions, only to collapse by February. They never locked in long enough to build the neural resilience required for true freedom. Think about it like this. Your brain has two competing forces: the limbic system, which screams for comfort, pleasure, and immediate gratification, and the prefrontal cortex, which strategizes, delays gratification, and envisions the future. Most people live dominated by their limbic system. They are slaves to impulse, chasing short-term highs while sabotaging long-term greatness. That's why they're broke, unhealthy, and unfulfilled. The key to freedom is strengthening the prefrontal cortex through deliberate practice. Deep work, meditation, fasting, physical training, anything that forces you to override impulse. That's locking in. That's breaking the chains. Now let me give you a real-world example. A friend of mine grew up in poverty. His family barely scraped by. He could have easily given in to the environment, drugs, gangs, excuses, but he locked in. He worked 3 jobs, studied late nights, built a business from scraps. Every day, he made choices that favored long-term vision over short-term comfort. Years later, he's free financially, mentally, spiritually, not because he was lucky, but because he rewired his brain daily to reject slavery. He chose the pain of discipline over the pain of regret. That is the blueprint. But most people choose the opposite. They talk about wanting freedom, but every action they take builds stronger chains. They binge watch instead of building. They gossip instead of grinding. They spend money they don't have to impress people they don't like. And they wonder why life feels like prison. The truth is brutal. You cannot unlock freedom if you keep reinforcing the circuits of slavery. Now let me take you into the biology of stress. Chronic stress, what most people live under daily, activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That system floods your body with cortisol, which not only weakens your immune system and damages your health, but also shrinks the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for memory and learning. In other words, slavery, whether financial, emotional, or social, literally makes you dumber. You think slower, you remember less, you problem solve worse. But here's the good news. When you lock in, when you take ownership of your environment and habits, your brain begins to repair itself. Neuroplasticity kicks in. You grow new neural connections. Your hippocampus literally increases in size. You become sharper, faster, more resilient. Freedom is not just a feeling, it's a measurable transformation in your biology. And let's not forget the power of identity. Psychology research shows that we act in alignment with who we believe we are. If you see yourself as a slave, you will act like one. If you see yourself as a victim, you will create scenarios to remain a victim. But if you lock in and adopt the identity of a builder, a leader, a free man or woman, your brain filters information differently. You notice opportunities instead of obstacles. You pursue solutions instead of excuses. You attract people who operate on the same frequency, and slowly the chains dissolve. Not because they were cut from outside, but because they became irrelevant to who you are becoming. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to imagine this. A man stands at the edge of a field. Behind him is the prison he has lived in for years. The gate is wide open. Ahead of him is a wilderness, uncertain, dangerous, filled with risk. He hesitates. He knows if he stays, he will be safe, fed, predictable, but he will remain a slave. If he steps out, he faces fear, struggle, the unknown, but he will be free. That moment of hesitation, that pause at the threshold, that's where most of humanity dies. They never step. They never lock in. They choose slavery disguised as safety. Now let's go deeper into tactics, because inspiration without execution is hallucination. Locking in requires you to take 3 critical steps. First, control your environment. Neuroscience proves that willpower alone is weak. If junk food is in your house, you will eventually eat it. If toxic people surround you, you will eventually mirror them. If distractions fill your workspace, you will eventually give in. Freedom requires building an environment that makes success the default. Remove the garbage, add the tools. Surround yourself with warriors, not victims. Second, master your physiology. Your brain is not separate from your body. Sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, lack of exercise, all of these weaken your prefrontal cortex and hand control to your limbic system. That means if you're tired, if you're weak, if you're chemically imbalanced, you are more likely to remain a slave to impulses. Locking in means treating your body like the machine that carries your freedom. It means fueling it, resting it, training it relentlessly. Third, radical accountability. No more lies, no more excuses, no more someday. Neuroscience shows that when goals are vague, the brain treats them as fantasy. But when goals are specific, time-bound, and tracked, the brain engages executive functions. Accountability turns dreams into directives. That's why the strongest people in history had codes, disciplines, mentors, or tribes that demanded the best from them. Freedom cannot be built in isolation. You need accountability, even if it comes from within. Ladies and gentlemen, let me be brutally honest here. Locking in is war. You are at war with the worst parts of yourself, your laziness, your fear, your cravings, your excuses. They are your slave masters. They are relentless, whispering in your ear, seducing you back into chains. But the war is winnable. Science has given us the weapons: neuroplasticity, habit formation, environmental design, physiological optimization, habit formation, cold climbing, the optimal impediments. And history has given us the proof. Men and women who broke every chain, who built empires from dust, who transformed themselves from slaves to leaders. But here's the thing, no one is coming to save you. not your government, not your boss, not your family. If you want freedom, you must lock in, you must decide right now that every breath you take from this day forward will be spent building freedom, not reinforcing slavery. You must decide that mediocrity is a crime against your potential. You must decide that comfort is poison. And if you do, your life will not just change, it will ignite. You will become a force that cannot be ignored, a presence that cannot be denied. Your brain will sharpen, your spirit will strengthen, and your future will expand beyond anything you thought possible. That, my friends, is what it means to lock in and escape slavery. But we are not done yet. I want to take you even further into the raw psychology of fear, the illusions that keep people enslaved, and the exact path to turn discipline into destiny. Because the truth is, you don't just need to know how to lock in. You need to feel it in your bones, live it in your actions, and breathe it in your soul.